Hello, and thank you for tuning into the New Orchid Show. In many cultures throughout known history, we encountered stories of teenage boys taking through special rituals which mark their passage from boyhood to manhood. These rites of passage essentially solidified individuals or groups' transition from one social state to another. Dr. Robert Lewis, who wrote a fantastic book titled Raising a Modern Day Knight, believed that one of the greatest tragedies of Western culture today is the absence of this type of ceremony. Upon reading his book, it would be very hard for me to disagree with Dr. Roberts' conclusion. It would seem that our contemporary culture, our contemporary society, is full of men who are unhappy with themselves, lost, rudderless, lacking the North Star guiding their direction, and exhibiting proclivities normally attributed psychologically to weak men. The most dangerous men who suffer from boy psychology, which manifests as immature masculinity. I think where this negative proclivity can make the most damage at the societal level would be, in my humble opinion, the world of politics, where you see imposters of men pouring into the vacuum space created by absence of authentic masculinity, just so they can play a very dangerous game of pretend. The ritual processes which turn boys into men in ancient cultures have completely eroded, causing a rather unique problem. A simple truism is to state that as a civilization, we have become too powerful not to be serious about how we govern the world. We no longer fight with sticks and stones, but modern sophisticated weapons of mass terror. As much as you would worry about a potential Blitzkrieg 2.0 in Europe, you'd probably worry way more about a hair-triggered nuclear apocalypse initiated by irresponsible leaders, both men and women, who are stuck in their childhood psychology. I know, I'm picking here an extreme example and I'm zooming way out to illustrate the potential first, second and third order effects of missing that crucial rite of passage transformational step in our developmental psychology. Like so many things we cover on this show, this subject matter, this theme we're trying to cover today of rites of passage carries a lot of nuances, and one has to do a fair amount of reading to truly understand why so many civilizations and cultures in our past had rites of passage firmly embedded in their operating systems. The term rite of passage has been present in common parlance for some time, but it's not as old as you might think. Its origins are connected to Arnold van Gennep's seminal work titled The Rites of Passage, which was published January 1, 1909. Van Gennep was the first anthropologist to note the regularity and significance of the rituals attached to their transitional stages in men's life, and his phrase for these, the rites of passage, consequently has become a part of the language of anthropology and sociology as we know it today. Van Gennep's work is absolutely fascinating. The book offers a deep and illuminating look at how humans move through life, marking our key turning points with events or rituals. The author notes that these rituals all share an underlying form, consisting of a tripartite process of separation, transition, and incorporation, and also demonstrate his theory again and again through close examination of hundreds of rituals across cultures geographically and temporally. Examining all the examples contained in a book, one has to conclude that it is not coincidental that big portion of rites of passage involve some form of pain. Pain of ordeal or ingestion of some kind of a poisonous plant like datura. Pain has been essential in these rituals because it signifies both the seriousness and the significance of the event itself, with elders essentially saying that the time of being and acting like a boy is over, and that the tribe or community elders are passing the obligation of adulthood with all of its responsibilities to the man formed on the back of the rite of passage. This solidified the idea that the man has to take the burden of responsibility on his shoulders going forward, and that the man, from this point on, holds the destiny of his people in his hands. These rituals were designed slightly differently for boys and girls, but in both instances were equally serious in the form because both properly initiated women, as well as men, were essential to the healthy thriving of a community, and then wider society. In our contemporary politically correct context, this type of thinking is somewhat frowned upon, but the simple fact is that young boys seek out hard challenges. They want to test their mettle and see how much courage and strength of character they can find within themselves. Without an outlet, without story, and without wise guidance from the elders or the father, a substantial portion of young males will embark on a kind of anti-hero's journey that will not only not initiate them into manhood, but will cause them to get stuck in boy psychology forever, uninitiated, destructive, and hopeless. Arnold van Gennep's book, along the work of Robert Moore and Doug Gillette's, who co-authored King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Rediscovering the Archetypes of the Mature Masculine, as well as Victor Turner's work on Rites of Passage, I would say has profoundly impacted how I think about certain issues plaguing a modern Western world. Once you realize the power and significance of rites of passage, you also and inevitably realize the destructive impact of their absence. And this essentially brings me to my guest today, Dr. Arne Rubinstein, who's an expert on rites of passage and adolescent development. He's got 30 years experience as a medical doctor, counselor, mentor, speaker, and workshop facilitator. A long time ago, he became increasingly aware and deeply disturbed by the high rate of harm that teenagers were subjecting themselves to, and which unfortunately had lifelong consequences for them. Witnessing totally unnecessary risk-taking behavior and disastrously high levels of mental health issues that left young people feeling completely lost, depressed, and unsupported, Dr. Rubinstein decided to do something about it. He started the Rites of Passage Institute in Byron Bay, as well as authored a fantastic book titled The Making of Men, Raising Boys to be Happy, Healthy and Successful. Arne used Rites of Passage as a tool to assist teenagers as they transition from a child to an adult in a safe and healthy way, while maintaining strong family relationships and passing on critical wisdom and knowledge. In 1993, he ran his first Rites of Passage camp for fathers and sons, which was a life-changing 3-day process for all who attended. A few years later, he stopped working as a medical doctor and moved full-time into creating Rites of Passage programs. I feel very grateful that Dr. Rubinstein has accepted my invitation to come on the show, and I'm very excited to find out more about his Rites of Passage Institute and the impact he made on thousands of people globally. I've got a lot of questions for the good doctor, so after this long setup, and I hope you didn't mind it, let's get him to do a bit of talking. Mr. Rubinstein, a very warm welcome to the New Orchid Show. Let's start at the very beginning with a short introduction and maybe tell us what led you to the role you are currently holding with the Rite of Passage Institute.
Hello, my name is Arne Rubinstein, and I am father of 2 boys, or 2 men now, a 32 and a 34-year-old, Jara and Jaden. I'm 60 years old myself. I started my professional career as a doctor, first in general practice and then did 15 years in emergency medicine. And I became very interested in the number of teenagers who were coming into the emergency department, way too many. And also that I was seeing a lot of older people in general practice, and I was treating them for issues that had started when they were teenagers. And I remember thinking, wow, we should be working with them when they're teenagers. And then about 30 years ago, I went on a men's program, and someone talked about this idea of rites of passage, and I started looking into rites of passage and started running some programs up near where I live in northern New South Wales, and then rites of passage and the concept of rites of passage have really taken over my life. And so now I am the CEO and founder of the Rites of Passage Institute. And our aim is to create rites of passage that are accessible to the mainstream everywhere and to bring them back again. And so we work training people and running programs of rites of passage in Australia and have helped set up programs in about 25 countries around the world.
Fantastic. Being a medical doctor, has that influenced your approach to how you've set up the Institute and how you've designed the programs that power it?
Yeah, being a doctor was a very influential part of my life. First of all, it's a privilege to be a doctor because you get to hear people's stories, and you also get to see people in really key transitional moments in their lives, good and not good. You get to see babies being born, but you also get to see people passing away and when they're really sick. And it was then that I realized first of all, that is a stage in life we just don't manage properly. And seeing so many young people in emergency, I also recognised that they were trying to do the things of adults while they were still children, and it wasn't working out. And so a lot of them were ending up in the hospital. And also that so many people were doing things when they were young that were affecting them the rest of their lives in a negative way. So it became very clear to me we need to work with our youth. We need to be creating preventative programs, not curative programs. And rites of passage that have been around for tens of thousands of years are still relevant as they always have been. And it really, the challenge is to work out how to do a rite of passage that's appropriate for today, for the young people of today, and not just the young people, but people of all ages who are going through transitions.
When I was doing a little bit of research, I obviously had a good look at your website where I found interesting information about your core principles and frameworks that your institute stands on and leverages in its day-to-day operations. And I wondered, how do these principles and frameworks draw from the traditional rites of passage? Can you tell us how you've designed and configured your core principles with history and tradition in mind?
Sure, I'm very interested in traditional rites of passage, and that all over the world for tens of thousands of years, Indigenous communities all recognised that you need to create some sort of transition process, some sort of rite of passage for boys and girls becoming young men, becoming young women, becoming adults, and not only for children going through that transition, but for people of all ages going through their major life transitions of getting married, having babies, becoming grandparents, elders, passing on. All of those should be supported with a healthy rite of passage rather than people trying to work it out themselves. So that was a really big thing. And then also to discover that not only did every Indigenous community create a rite of passage, the stages were always the same, in that whoever was going through the rite of passage would be taken away or leave their everyday life in their community, go into a space to actually go through the transformation of a rite of passage, because that's what a rite of passage is. It's a transformational program. It's a transformational event, something you can't go back to how you were before. If you have a baby, you can never go back to someone who hasn't had a baby. When you become an adult, you can never go back in truth to being what you were when you were a child. You can be childish, but that's very different. Um, and so there was the separation, this going through a transformation, and then returning to the community in a different way and changed or transformed because of the process you've been through. So all the Indigenous communities created these transitional processes with three stages: a separation, a transformation, and then an integration back into the community. So we can still be doing that. And a classic example is a school camp. Kids leave school, they have to leave their phones behind. They're out in this container of the school camp. They have this great opportunity to think about life, to hear each other's stories, to actually go through a transformational process, and then to come back into the community different from how they were before they left on the camp. So we use those stages to create modern rites of passage, and we also use the four elements that were always present in the transformational stage, in that middle phase, to actually create a change or a transition.
When you're looking at the modern world, in what ways do you think the modern society has lost touch with traditional rites of passage, and what are the consequences of this loss?
Why we have lost is a whole series of events that include the breakdown in community, the focus on consumerism, um, uh, just the lack of rites of passage. More easy is to observe the impact of the loss of rites of passage. So, one of the most important rites of passage in any Indigenous community was a child moving through a rite of passage to become an adult. Now, if you don't create that rite of passage, either they'll try and create their own, which can often cause great problems in car accidents and fights and use of drugs and inappropriate sexual behaviours, that's when they try and create their own. And if they don't go through one at all, the danger is they remain in the childlike behavior, the childlike psychology in how they see the world and act, and they become physically adults, but they're still thinking and acting like children, which is it's all about me and I'm the center of the universe. And then they get into positions of power. They may even run countries or businesses or families, and they're still children in their mind and in their psyche. They're still thinking about themselves and power and those things, but they're not doing it from an adult point of view, which is how much good can I do? How well can I look after this community? How do I make the really hard decisions based on what's best for the community, not what's best for me? So I think one of the ways it manifests is in a gross deficit of healthy adult leaders. I believe we actually live in an adolescent world that's run by boys instead of being run by good men and powerful women. And that's the other issue with one of many issues with lack of rites of passage is we don't support women to find their power, their influence, their voice, and we risk keeping them in a girl behavior. So there's really critically important reasons why rites of passage were utilized for tens of thousands of years, and they would use the theory that we're all basically moving up a staircase of life from baby to child to young adult to out of home, maybe a parent, maybe a community leader, maybe an elder, and rites of passage have been designed to help us move through each of those stages.
Yeah, that's very interesting and very, very true. Now, when reading history books, you find out that many ancient cultures have these very rich mythologies surrounding rites of passage. Are there specific myths or archetypes that your programs emphasize, and if so, which ones and why?
So, mythology and archetypes were definitely a part of many traditional rites of passage. And one of the challenges that we have is that we are creating new rites of passage because the old rites of passage don't exist, and we're actually a new society. And in some of the communities that we work with, their rites of passage have been around for 10,000 years, and they have myths that came in at some stage there, and no one actually knows exactly when, and they're rich and powerful and deeply connected to the actual community who's going through the rite of passage. I fully believe that rites of passage are relevant to every community, that the stages of a rite of passage, the separation, transformation, and then integration back into the community, apply for everyone. But we actually need to be creating rites of passage that are appropriate for the community today and the world that we live in. So we're not trying to create the same rite of passage that the Satere Mawe tribe in Brazil may have done for thousands of years in the Amazon jungle. And we're not trying to create the same rite of passage that the Aboriginal Australians did here in the desert or anywhere. We need to create a rite of passage that's relevant for the communities they're working in. And that is actually parts of rite of passage. They change as the community evolves. And where we don't even have rites of passage, we're actually having to reinvent them. And so the use of mythology and archetypes is it's kind of challenging, but it's also very possible because one of the key elements in any rite of passage in that transformational stage is, in fact, the sharing of stories. And when stories are shared, that is how wisdom and knowledge is passed on, and that is how learning occurs, as opposed to telling people how it needs to be. Now, in an Indigenous community, they may have shared those stories through actual storytelling or through songs or dances or paintings in caves on rocks, all sorts of different ways. We have to work out the best way for us to share stories. The element of sharing stories remains, just the way that it's done is different. And if we're going to use mythology, we need to know that any mythology we're using is actually being borrowed from another culture, because most of my rites of passage I work with are in modern Western societies, and we do a lot of work in schools. We don't have mythology. We do have old stories, and we do have our own stories, and they're the ones that we focus on. But if I come to stories for a moment, because they're so important in all rites of passage, what stories do is first of all they build community. So if I share my life story with you and you share with me, then all of a sudden I know you, and when I know you, I have empathy and I have connection, and we actually become part of a community. If I've never seen you before and don't know anything about your story and don't know you, you're another person, but we're not actually technically community in that same way. So stories are a very powerful way of building community. When elders share stories and the young get to listen, that is a fabulous way of passing on wisdom and knowledge. And the third use of stories is the ancient stories, the mythology that you refer to. And when we hear an old story, what tends to happen is that a certain point in that story, or a number of points, not the whole story, but certain points, will really stand out to us. And they say that's our psychological signpost. So there's a very famous story about the half-child from Borneo. And in a nutshell, there's a child who's only got half their body, and that can happen in a myth. And at some point, that child becomes difficult in the community and has to leave. And then there's the whole story that goes on after that. But a lot of people relate to that moment of the child having to leave, and they relate to their own experience of having to leave their community. And there are many points in that story and many places where different people will get somewhat activated, and that is their psychological signpost. There's another classic moment in that story where the child meets another half-child with the other half of their body, and they fight. So instead of embracing each other, they fight. And people think, I would have thought you would, embrace the other half of yourself when you met the other half. But when you think about it, often we don't want to meet the other half of ourselves. In fact, we spend all our lives in denial of that other half even being there. So it's kind of not surprising that they fight. And then eventually they join and they're able to go back to the community. The modern myth is that many young people leave their community, go out, find their other half or other part, come back to their community. The community is not set up to recognize them and integrate them, and so we leave again. That was part of my story. I left, went traveling after school, had incredible adventures, grew up, learned all this stuff, came back to my hometown. No one was really interested. No one really wanted to know who I was, still saw me as they did before I'd left. And so I felt totally uncomfortable and just wanted to leave again, and did in the end, which is probably a shame because it happens a lot, and people go away, pick up new skills and gifts, bring it back to the community. The community can't see it, so they take that knowledge and learning away. And I'm sure there'd be many people listening to this who would recognize that feeling and knowledge that they had to leave at some point, that struggle when they were away in all the different things that happened and meeting other parts of themselves, and then that even more of a struggle when you come back and you're not recognized and integrated, and so you either struggle to do so or leave again.
That is super interesting, and it connects to my next question for you. As I was wondering about the effectiveness of the process in modern contemporary context, what you've said earlier, at least that's how I read it, was that mythology is important, but it's not foundational to how rites of passage need to be constructed for the modern world. So, do you think there is a certain level of risk associated with adjustments necessary to modernize rites of passage for our technologically advanced and somewhat risk-averse world that can ultimately render these new updated rites of passage not as effective as their original versions, because the real danger component has been either completely removed or partially reduced? And I know it's a little bit convoluted, this question, but I hope it makes
Yeah, but
sense.
it's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, listen, back in the day when they used to do rites of passage, they used to take, let's say they took 20 kids out on their rite of passage into the desert or to kill a wild animal, they may have only got 15 back. And they would say, oh, yeah, that's okay. The others weren't supposed to come back. You know, when we do rites of passage, if we take 20 kids, we have to bring 20 back every time. So already we see that the rites of passage are very different. And, it's we are talking about communities who their whole emphasis was around the creation of ceremony, sacred spaces, rites of passage. You know, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where there's huge emphasis on employment, consumerism, um, how we look.
Safety.
Pardon?
Safety.
Safety. So, you know, what we're doing is, um, well, having done it for 30 years, it's been a struggle to bring it in because I have found there's many people in society who don't want to grow up, who don't want to move through the steps. Like, why would you want to accept getting older and becoming an elder when you're going to be discarded and become invisible? In a traditional community, the elders got the most respect. In our communities, often they get the least respect, and the ones we give the most respect to are the young ones. So there's a lot of stuff that's we're working with, but I have seen an enormous growth in interest in rites of passage in the last 30 years, to the point where back in the day I would give a talk and two people would roll up. Now I give a talk and there's not enough chairs in the hall and they have to bring in more chairs. And schools are contacting us and saying, we want to really modify our, what we do with our year nines, our 15-year-olds, and base it all around rites of passage. Can you help us find ways to introduce rites of passage into the school? So that's the shift that I'm seeing, because we're recognizing if we don't do something for our young ones, first of all, they'll stay in child behavior, which is a disaster. Second of all, their mental health will be majorly impacted, which we're clearly seeing the worst mental health um, figures ever. And they won't learn basic skills like resilience and adaptability and all these things that were actually woven into the rites of passage that they had to go through 100, 200 years ago. So what we've done is recognize, I talked about this 3 stages of separation, transformation, and then integration back into the community. My work has been, what does it take to actually take a transformation? And there are 4 key things that are always in a rite of passage to create a transformation. The first is the sharing of stories, which I've spoken of. The second is there's always some sort of challenge or ordeal. There's something difficult. And having worked as an emergency medicine doctor, what I know is if we don't create the challenges for the young ones, they will go out and create their own. And, I talked about sending 20 kids out on a rite of passage and only getting 15 back. And they used to say that's okay and we can't do that. What I can also say is we're losing kids. We're losing kids in car accidents, drug overdoses, alcohol issues, suicides, stupid, risky behavior. So it's happening anyway. And it's like, how can we do it in a safe way but has the effect? So there's always some sort of challenge or ordeal, which will be obviously different depending on what age they are and what stage they're at. That's the second one, challenge. The third is a creation of a vision for who you're going to become in the future. So if I'm going through a rite of passage and I'm becoming a young adult, at some stage during the rite of passage, it's like some time to think about or work with what sort of adult am I going to be? What are my values going to be? What sort of work do I want to do? How do I want to spend my time and with what sort of people? How can I contribute to the earth rather than just taking from the community? So there's a vision process in a rite of passage. And there's also what we call a recognition of the gifts or the genius and spirit that is in each person. And what I mean by that is every Indigenous community believe that every child is different. They all have a spirit and they all have their own unique gifts or genius. And that the biggest role for us as parents, elders, and caregivers is to help the young people find their genius, find their spirit, find their gifts, and find a way to bring that out into the community. And so when we do those things where we do share stories, create a challenge, have a vision process, and find a way to recognize and acknowledge the gifts, talents, genius, and spirit of each person, we get transformation. I know it because I've done it for over 30 years in 25 countries and seen hundreds of thousands of people go through these programs, and I know it creates a transformation. And then there's a challenge to bring it into the community so the community can see it, so the person who's gone through it knows they've been seen, and then they can bring their gifts to the community. And by the way, it's only a gift if you give it away, by definition. If you don't give it away, it's just another possession. And we don't need more possessions. We need more of people's gifts in the community. Which, in terms of what you're talking about, is exactly the problem. People are holding on to their gifts and trying to get more possessions, which is the childish way of doing it, rather than recognizing if I have a gift or if I have power, if I have money, let's say, that shouldn't mean I can build a bigger fence around my house and have a more expensive car and all the rest. It could actually mean I can do more good in the community.
You know, everything now, relatively speaking, is easy. Easy in the modern world. The role of the close community has been completely obliterated because people don't need it as much as they used to make life work relatively well. Half a century ago, I feel we used to put more effort into the maintenance of community because we naturally needed each other more. And that is no longer the case with the sort of spoils of modern technology. Let me ask you this.
Hang on. Sorry, just before you go on, Patrick. We say everything is easy, but if we just even look at that, the figures would say that for the young, it's actually harder than ever because their mental health is worse than it's ever been. So it appears easy. This is classic. It appears that everything's easy. The kids are getting everything. Something goes wrong and there's a tutor or there's someone to pick them up or someone to sweep the path in front of them. But actually they're struggling. So I ask, is it easier than it's ever been? And by being soft and gentle and not challenging, all of these things, are we doing them any favors? If we don't create any challenges for them, they grow up without any resilience. And then the first opportunity they get, a lot of them do the stupidest thing they can get. The first access they have to alcohol or drugs, they get blind drunk or overdose. Or the first time they can get their hands on a car, they crash it. Or when they go to schoolies at the end of year 12, they go and do something they're going to regret for the rest of their lives. So the whole "it's easy today" is a really interesting concept.
I absolutely agree with that. And that's why in my statement, I said easy, relatively speaking, because there is quite a lot of nuance there. I totally appreciate that. For the people in the audience who are not quite familiar with the philosophy, psychology, and just generally speaking have not read anything about Rites of Passage, maybe we can pivot a little bit and talk about Van Gennep's The Rites of Passage, which I'm guessing you would be very familiar with that text.
I am. I wanted to do what he did.
Perhaps you could discuss the concepts of separation, initiation, and return as outlined in Van Gennep's The Rites of Passage book, and talk about how you've integrated these concepts into your programs at the Rites of Passage Institute that you're running.
Sure. So Van Gennep was a Belgian anthropologist who in the late 1800s travelled to indigenous communities around the world. And he was the first one who wrote about, they're doing all these ceremonies and they put so much emphasis into acknowledging the different key transition moments in a person's life. And he went on to talk about how he was the one who named Rites of Passage, Rites de Passage, and talked about it being a ritual way of moving through a passage to go from one stage in life to the next. So it's a ritual. It's something that's happened for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years, and it's a passageway. So you spend time in this, you go into the passageway, let's say as a child, You spend time in there, and you might be in there for a week, a month, a year. Time changes, so it's not about how long. You're just in there for as long as it takes. And then you come out differently. You come out as a young adult. And so he talked about, with the separation, they would take the young ones away from the community. Often they had a special place they would go to. It might be, something they'd built, some huts or something somewhere away from the community. They might take them many, many miles, many kilometers away from, they might take them out into the desert or out into the forest or somewhere, but they would always take them away, and the elders would be there, the facilitators would be there with them. So that would happen. That's the separation stage, because they recognize you can't do it at home or in the classroom while you're sitting at your desk or anything like that. And when you're gone and you're in that passageway, you don't come back and visit. You don't get on your phone. Your parents don't come and check in and see if you're okay. You're in it. And then when they were in that place, they would work with those four elements that I talked about and other things, but there'd always be sharing of stories, and the mythology would come up and the elders would share stories. So there was that. There would be challenges, and the challenges, could be life-threatening or could be just endurance-based, depending on the community. And often for the boys, the challenges were more about being able to face the possibility of death or dealing with severe pain. And in a lot of those communities, the boys were going to become hunters or warriors, so they had to be able to deal with death or pain. And often for girls, the challenge was more around endurance, because they needed the endurance for a lot of the things that they would go through as women. We look at it today like, well, that's how it was then, but today there's a lot more crossover, and it's not as black and white as a boy becomes a man, a girl becomes a woman. And so we believe that, young men need to be able to uh, deal with endurance, and women need to find their inner warrior and their inner strength. And all of them need to learn to listen to their inner voice. So they'd always have story, challenge, a vision for who they were going to become in the community, because they didn't all become the same person. Some of them would become the storyteller, some of them would become a fire maker, some of them would become the healers, some of them would become the explorers and hunters, and they would find a way, and they would create a vision and also recognize that each of them was different, and they each had different gifts to bring to the community, and those gifts would vary in their form depending on what stage they were at. So the gifts of a young adult would be different to the gifts of a parent or an elder. And the idea is that those gifts would keep coming out through their whole lives. So that was the sort of the initiation and transformation stage. And then they would return to the community, and generally, or often, the whole community would be there to welcome them back, and the whole community would know that that young person had been through a rite of passage. And often the person who'd been through the rite of passage would be marked in some way, maybe with a tattoo, maybe with a scar. Some of them, they knocked out a front tooth or gave them a piercing or did all these things or changed their clothes, so that the whole community knew this person had been through a rite of passage, and the person themselves knew and felt and was aware that the whole community knew they had been through, so that they could come back at this new stage and not go back into the old stage of before they went through their rite of passage. So for us, it's about how do we create this in a modern context? And what we do, so where I live here in Byron Bay, we have a 150 acre property where we've built a whole big campsite, and we have groups of um, young people, and you have a young person and a parent. So it might be a father-son or a father-daughter, mother-son, mother-daughter, different programs in different ages, and they come here and they leave their mobile phones we have a box we put them in, and they spend time in this passage or container, and we do those things. We share stories, we create challenges, we make visions, we do honouring and recognition of the gifts and the genius of each of the young people, and then we do an integration process when they leave. So that's one way that they're actually set up, and these happen in a few places around Australia. Or we work with schools, and schools have a perfect opportunity because the children are going, they come into school as babies, as young children, and hopefully they leave as young adults. And one of the transition is from child to young adult. And schools run camps, and camps are a perfect opportunity to be away from the school, away from the family, not have mobile phones. And if we can bring in story, challenge, vision, and recognition into the school camp, we can create a transformation. And then we do a whole process with the community to welcome them back, an integration process they do at home with their parents. And so we're creating that rite of passage, and we're building the community within the school.
Now, you've talked about this briefly a few times today. So you're running these camps with parents and the children, and these camps help to facilitate a vision of masculinity. I understand that this process is equally applicable to females and can obviously produce a healthy vision of femininity too, but for the time being and for the sake of this question and argument, I'm focusing on the boys here.
Yeah.
Can you describe the characteristics of this vision and talk about how it contrasts with these potentially harmful societal messages about manhood, which I'm sure you're aware of? There is this very strange game being played in a Western society with certain people in the media and in academia claiming that all boys by default are toxic.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going with this.
I do. And look, I will name that it's a very tricky time for boys and young men, as it is for girls and young women, but we're talking about the boys and young men. And the influences include people like Andrew Tate, people, the porn that they all have access to on their phones, the mixed messaging of, are boys supposed to be tough and not cry and drink lots of beer, or are they supposed to be vulnerable and sensitive, and all of these things? And, there's not a clear pathway for them to follow, and that creates a lot of issue. And we have the whole non-binary and gender diverse, and there are a significant and percentage of boys who don't relate to being a boy and don't relate to being a man, and actually feel that their role and their pathway is different, and we need to support that as well. So in our work, we primarily focus on supporting them to work out their own principles and values. And what is incredibly interesting is that when we take away their phones, when we put them in nature, when we stop judging them and we let them hear the stories of elder men and hear the stories of others, then when we ask them about what's important to them and who they want to be, what comes out is incredibly special and beautiful. They don't come out with the values or the philosophy that you hear Andrew Tate talking about. And they don't come out with, all these other things. Most of them want to be happy. They want to be kind. They want to be in good relationships. If they're going to become parents, they want to be good parents. And so it really is about allowing them to find their own values. If we talk about the values of our personal organisation, it's around respect, responsibility, and awareness. So as long as I'm respectful, as long as I take responsibility for my actions and my impact on others, and as long as I work on being aware of what's happening around me and how what I do impacts that, then that creates a great freedom in working out how I want to be. And further to that, an example is if we're running a father-son camp, we'll do a circle where we sit man, boy around a fire, and the older men get to share a story about what life was like for them when they were the age of these boys and what their own relationship was like with their father. And then we say to the boys, if you become a father, what would you like your son or daughter to say about you? And the answer that the boys give us are beautiful. We hear things like, I'd like them to say that I was always present, that I listened to them, that I loved them and supported them to become who they are. These sorts of things. And that is where we feel these boys are actually creating a vision as to if they become a parent, what sort of parent they want to become. But we also support those boys who say, look, I don't want to become a parent, or, I don't feel it's my role that, my calling or my truth is that I have a different gender orientation. And rites of passage are really about bringing out the individual. And we want a diverse community. We need a diverse community. Um, and so the way we work, the biggest thing is no one should be there telling the boys who they have to be or how they have to be. We can share our stories, but we can't lecture to them. So, we may have some people on our program who are religious, and we may have some people who are not religious. And we say, fine, if you want to talk about religion or how you feel about it, or spirituality, how you feel about it, fine, you can do that. But you just can't tell these boys that they have to be religious, and you can't tell them that they are not allowed to be religious. You can share your story, and they can hear your story and the stories of the others, and then they work it out for themselves what their truth is. And hopefully, by the way, the only thing I'll add in here as well, people might think, oh, then they'll just become completely self-centered anarchists. But when at the same time they're hearing the stories of other people, and including people their own age, and you're building community, you're much less likely to be a self-centered anarchist if you belong to a community than if you feel you're the only person and no one else cares about you and no one's interested and no one matters.
Oh, absolutely. I think community is the keyword to so many things that you've been talking about today. What we're seeing in the modern world is gradually, and this is more and more pronounced, is the consequence of atomizing society and the loss of that community. I think what would be interesting to the audience is if you could possibly share a specific example of a transformation you have witnessed in a participant who has gone through your program. What elements were sort of most impactful in their journey, if you are okay to disclose a specific story?
Sure. In terms of talking about transformations that I've seen, a week ago, I had a young man come here to my property to visit me. He'd rung me and sent me a number of texts and said he wanted to come and visit. He arrived. He's 32 years old. He shared with me how he came on camp 19 years ago when he was 13. And he talked about how it was difficult that period of time. He had a difficult relationship with his father, and he was lost and confused and angry and looking for trouble. And he said that camp and the way it changed his relationship with his family and other men from the community has totally impacted and changed his life. And 19 years later, he still thinks about it, he still references it, and he came and shared, one, because he wanted to tell me, and two, because he wants to get involved in the work and become a leader. And our 38-year-old camp manager, who has two sons, also came on camp when he was 14 years old and was a difficult kid, and came back as what we call a returning young man a year later to help, and was still difficult, and then kept in contact with me. And I actually mentored him at a period of time when he was having a hard time in his late teens, early 20s. And he is now our camp manager. He's brilliant, he's insightful, he's a genuine leader. I mean, the transformations we see are not just kids who rock up on camp and don't want to be there, and by the end they go, wow, this is amazing, every kid should do it, and I just want my father to spend more time with me. Yes, that happens every camp, but it's the long-term transformations that I'm most interested in. And I know that the people who go through our camps, the boys, will be better parents, better community members, better partners as a result of having been through this work. And similarly with the girls, they will have different trajectories in their lives as a result of being through these camps.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a beautiful story and a beautiful example. And something like this would make a grown man cry, surely, because you're realizing that you've impacted a young man's life at the age of 13. He's coming back to you, decades later with this sort of feedback. It's incredibly positive.
It's extraordinary. I mean, that's what I love the most. And these are not single stories. Many men who've said to me, I came on camp 10, 15 years ago and it's changed my relationship with my son forever and how we talk to each other. And, because I'm part of a community up here all over the place. I go to the shoe repair place in Byron Bay and he goes, hey, I came on that camp with you 15 years ago, and I bought a boy and he wasn't my son, but it was my friend's son and dad wasn't around. And she asked me to go and I did. And it's the most incredible thing I've done. And I'm still in contact with that boy and it changed my life. And, because this work also changes the lives of the adults who come on the program because they get to share their stories and they get to talk about things they may have never talked about, but that are deeply inside them and inside their psyches. And that is a major healing and growth event for them. And when we talk about, there's a rite of passage for the child who's becoming a young adult, but there's also a rite of passage for the parent or elder who's moving to the next stage in their life. And both of those have to happen together to be truly impactful. Because if the child moves up a stage, but their parents and the other people around don't, and still keep seeing them as a child and treating them as a child, they're likely to push that young adult back down into the place of a child, but now a very unhappy child because they've seen something else and they know they're no longer in their true place. They're not a child. And so there's a really negative impact, which is why we always work with the adults. And even if we're, say, doing something on a school and we can't have the parents there, we make sure that when they go home, we make sure the parents are there at the end, so they see the students coming home and they have some really important discussions right away at the end, and then they have a program and a series of discussions and exercises to do over a month, 6 weeks at home with their child.
Looking at your institute, the Rite of Passage Institute that you're running in Byron Bay, there essentially are two pathways for people. One is for parents, so a father or a mother can bring their children, pay a small fee, and go through the program.
Yeah.
Actually, I shouldn't have said a small fee because we haven't talked about fees.
I'll tell you what it is. Let's talk about the fees, by the way. It's a reasonable fee because it's a life-changing event. People will pay all this money for all sorts of things. So we have a big team of highly qualified and experienced facilitators. So we charge a reasonable and decent fee. But we also have a strong scholarship program. So for people who can't afford that, we support them. So I always say, I don't want anyone to not come because of the money. And we have multiple people. We had a man come on our camp last week. We had 80 men and boys from around Australia and some who'd flown in from Singapore. And one of the men at the end said, I'm going to donate scholarships for 10 boys to come on the program who couldn't otherwise afford it. And I'm going to do that every year.
Amazing.
So, yes, one thing we do is we run camps here.
Yeah, so this is what I wanted to ask you about the second path. So obviously, path number one is for parents and kids. Path number two is for teachers and facilitators. So how did you structure the program for facilitators? Like, what's the objective? What's the point?
We have a training program. We train people in the framework of a rite of passage. And given that our vision is to have rites of passage mainstream again, I've worked out the best way to do that is to be open source. So what I mean by that is we train people. We have a 3-day training that we do here in Byron Bay and also that I run internationally and sometimes in other parts of Australia. But in that program, they learn about the framework of a rite of passage, and then we encourage people to take that framework and do something in their own way, in their own community, and call it their own thing. So they might do it in their family for one of their children. They might do it for an adult. They might do it in their community. They might do it at work. They might do it at school. The framework can overlay into all these places, but we are not a franchise. I don't want to control or make money out of this growth because it's just too hard to manage and do that. It doesn't actually work. And we have found the best scale model, give people the information as much as we can, and then support them to design programs, create additional training for facilitation skills if that's something they want, and encourage them to go and do it. And since we've been doing that, as I said, it's now spread to 25 countries and maybe 50, 60 places around Australia. And it is really scaling up. We've had over 400,000 people go through programs globally, and it's definitely starting to take hold.
Well, that is really nice to hear that everything is sort of, on the right trajectory for you, and there's a lot of growth potential in the near future as the demand from parents and potential facilitators and school teachers is growing. How are you thinking about the Institute over the next 5-10 years? Well, like, what's in store? What are your plans?
Well, we intend to continue our trainings. We're also developing a really world-class online training program that we've actually been funded to develop. And we'll continue to run our training programs and offer our programs, and to create information and resources for people who do want to be involved and to create Rites of Passage programs. And for people, the best way to find out about that is through our website, which is the Rites of Passage Institute, Rites spelled RITES, Rites of Passage Institute.org. ORG.
And what about social media channels? Please do take this opportunity to let the audience know where to go if they want to get up to speed with the latest.
Yeah, we have an Instagram channel, the Rites of Passage Institute. We have Facebook pages. We have LinkedIn. In this modern world, we have to have all the social media things out there, and we manage that as well as we can. And fortunately, now that I'm becoming an elder and I'm 60, I have someone else doing a lot of the social media, which is fantastic. And she's brilliant and 32 or something like that. And yeah, it's a community effort.
Awesome. Well, Arne, thank you very much for today. This was highly informative, and you're doing really wonderful work. I'm very impressed. Very, very impressed.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
That was Dr. Arne Rubinstein, CEO and founder of the Rites of Passage Institute. This episode was a good primer, I think, to get you thinking about the rites of passage and their relevance, as well as the potential in the modern contemporary context. Please do take a look at the show notes, where you'll find all the relevant links, link to the Rites of Passage Institute website, as well as their social media channels, and links to the 4 books I would recommend you read if you are interested in a deeper dive beyond today's interview. These books include The Making of Man, Raising Boys to Be Happy, Healthy and Successful, written by today's guest, Arnold van Gennep's The Rites of Passage. I also recommend you have a look at Robert Moore and Doug Gillette's King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Rediscovering the Archetypes of the Mature Masculine, and Victor Turner's The Forest of Symbols. Thank you very much for your attention today, and see you next time.